Welcome back to Education Matters. In the first segment, we talked to the two Educational Opportunity Study Group co-chairs. Now we're joined by two guests who help lead the work on childhood trauma and race equity. We have Dr. Katie Rosanbalm. Katie is at Duke University. She is the research scientist with the Duke Center for Child and Family Policy. And we have James Ford, who's with the Public School Forum of North Carolina, also was our North Carolina Teacher of the Year in 2014. Thank you both for being here. Now, Katie, I'm going to start with you. Sure. Just so we can level set the conversation for our viewers, what is considered childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences?
Well, Keith, trauma is really a person's reaction or their response to something in their life that's really scary, stressful, frightening for them, so much that it overwhelms their ability to cope with it. And that can be something that happens one time but is really significant for them, or it can be something that's ongoing and just kind of happens over and over and really wears down their ability to cope with it. And that can range from, violence experiences in the home, child abuse, domestic violence, violence in the community as well, or it could be just the ongoing impact of poverty, not knowing where you're going to have your next meal, not knowing where you're going to sleep the next night. It could also be dealing with a parent who's not there, someone who is your attachment figure but has been incarcerated, has been deployed overseas, or maybe someone who's dealing with substance abuse or mental illness challenges. And even it could be something that is a one-time trauma but is really significant. For example, Hurricane Matthew. Okay. So kids not knowing where they're going to be the next day, right, where their house is going to be.
Now, why do we need to understand what kids are going to when it comes to education? I mean, why is that important?
Yeah, it's so important because trauma has an enormous effect on kids' development. And it affects their development in their relationships with people, in their ability to cope with their feelings, and in their behavior in the classroom, as well as their ability to learn. And really what happens is a brain-based reaction where kids become so much more sensitized. They're scanning their environment all the time for something dangerous that might be out there. And when they see it, they're going to go really quickly into something that we call fight, flight, or freeze. And what's going to happen is a kid that goes into a fight response, they're going to be angry, they're going to look defiant, and a teacher's going to look at this kid and think, this is a bad kid. Right. This is a kid I need to punish. And actually, it's a hurting kid.
And that's kind of what we heard Dr. Flood mention in the first, is that sometimes those kids were just seen as bad kids or troublemakers, and the schools need to be better equipped. Well, James, let me ask you. Now, race equity, racial issues in America in schools, pretty complex stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But what most surprised you in digging into the issues of race equity as part of this study group?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I mean, there's a deeply entrenched history there in the relationship between race and education. So some things were predictable and other things weren't. But I have to tell you, what was really striking was the contrast between the overrepresentation of students of color with the underrepresentation of students in programs like academically and intellectually gifted. So you take black students in North Carolina are sort of the one subgroup demographic that's overrepresented, and the areas that they're overrepresented are mostly cognitive in nature. But then they're drastically, African Americans and Hispanic students, drastically underrepresented when it comes to identifying students who are intellectually and academically gifted. So there's a very dangerous narrative that undertows that when looking at some of the data.
So what things can the schools or the district do to immediately address some of these things, like we saw on the break about the discipline disparity, for example?
Yeah, so the racial equity is a mile wide and several miles deep, right? I mean, there's just so much there in spanning that. But things that can happen most immediately are with discipline disparities. First, being transparent about your data, both from a school level, a district level, and of course at a state level, looking at and publishing your reports of your disciplinary infractions and breaking it down into category, and then looking for those gaps and making sure that it's available for public consumption. The second thing I would say is making sure that you train teachers, train administrators in implicit racial bias. I think what undergirds a lot of these things is not an intentional or malicious attempt to malign students of color. It's an unconscious thing that's a product of our socialization, and everybody, is a part of that.
So there's some recommendations across this study group report. What should policymakers, when they look at, say, in this race equity, what should they be thinking about?
So the wonderful thing about this report is that it takes a complex issue, one that's hundreds of years old, and attempts to produce some recommendations that can hit the ground running right now. So policymakers should look at it from 3 different levels. Those who create policy at the school level, at the district, and at the state, and say, what pieces of these can I implement within my sphere of influence? There are some levers that could be pulled by the administrator, some things that are just a matter of changing the way the school approaches a particular issue. There are some things that the school board or the superintendent can do. So every every policymaker, rather, should be able to look at that document and ask themselves, where could I insert myself or be able to take this information and insert it in my institution?
Katie, did you see the same thing in terms of childhood trauma? There are things that policymakers can do, but there's also things that can be done right now, like a school could start operating differently.
Absolutely. You know, I think the most important thing that a school can do is find ways to make the climate a safe one for kids. Kids need to feel safe emotionally, physically, and academically so that they can relax and start to take in the learning. They can't learn if they're nervous and they're looking around for danger. So just, I mean, simple things like how you welcome a child in the morning and just, welcoming them with a smile and really caring about how they're doing.
Well, this is important work. What you've done, I think, is starting a very important conversation. So thank you both for being here for this conversation.
Absolutely. It's great
Thanks
to be
so much.
Here.
When we come back, we're going to the headquarters of the North Carolina PTA for our Leadership Spotlight.